Let's take a look at a file that may be common for you to receive on a regular basis. We've got month data, sales data, as well as you'll see on this total row, we've got the region associated with that total. Now, this is helpful, but if we wanted to do further analysis on it, maybe look at sales across January for all 4 regions, it makes it a little difficult to use this in a pivot table. Now, if this was data that I only were going to use one time, of course, I would just take and copy the Northeast over to a new column and then delete these rows. But after a while, that can become tedious, and depending on how much data you have, it can take you quite a while. Now, what I would really like to have is on this After tab is to have my data laid out like this. So it's the same format, but instead of having the region just on the total field, I've moved it up into a new column. Now I can create a pivot table and do further analysis on this. So I'm going to show you today how we can convert data that's in this format to data that's in this format using Power Query. All right, I'm going to go ahead and save this, close it, and I'm just going to envision that we've got a file that we either through our ERP or accounting system that we download on a weekly or monthly basis, and we need to perform this analysis. So we're going to assume that each month we're downloading this file and it's available to us. So let's use Power Query to import that data, make the changes to it, and put it in a format that we can use a little easier. Okay, so I'm going to go up to the Data tab. Now you can't see that any indication that this is Power Query, but in the background it is Power Query that's going to run these functions for us. So if I go to the Data tab and choose Get and Transform Data, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose Get Data from File, and then we'll choose From Excel Workbook. And once that opens, the file selector, I'll go ahead and select that file that's on my desktop right now. And here's the file. Once I select it, Power Query is going to recognize that there's 2 different worksheets, and it's going to ask me which worksheet do you want the data from, and I'm going to choose Before. I'll see a little preview of this data. This is the one I want to work with, and then I'm going to choose, after choosing that worksheet, I'm going to choose Transform Data. Once I do that, it's going to open up Power Query, and it's going to perform a couple of steps for us to get us going. So because our worksheet was named Before, you'll notice that a query has been created with the name Before. Now I'm going to change that over in the right side under Properties, Name. I'm going to change this to Sales Data by Month. And that's going to update our query name. And let's take a look at some of the steps that Power Query did for us. Number 1, at this first step, which is the source, if I were to open up the dialog associated with this by clicking this little cog to the right of source, it will show which file that we were using. Now what we can do after we build this Power Query is we can go back and update the source with the new file for each month, and then it will apply the steps, and we won't have to think about this anymore. So this is our source file. It then navigated to just that worksheet, and it recognized that, hey, we've got column headers here, and it created this step called Promoted Headers, and you can see now that the first row was converted to the headers. And finally, under Change Type, it recognized that the month is text. And under Sales, now Sales, it is recognizing as an integer. And the reason that it's recognizing it as an integer is because my data did not have any decimals in it. So it by default said, okay, the simplest thing to do is just make this an integer. Now I really don't want this to be an integer because my data may eventually have decimals in it. So what I'm going to do is under the sales column, you'll notice that the integer is selected here. Now I can click on this button, and instead of it being a whole number, I'm going to change it to be a decimal number. Now because I'm on this step of change type, Power Query is going to ask me, do you want to replace the current step or do you want to add a new step? And it's perfectly fine to replace the current step. So I'm going to choose replace current step. And you'll notice here in the top in our formula bar, it's saying the month is text and it's saying that the sales column is a type number. Okay, so that's we've imported the data, and now we want to start on our original problem, which was to raise the total column information up to create a new column based on that. So I'm going to do this in a couple of steps. First thing I'm going to do is just identify whether this row of data is either the detailed data that we want to keep or if it's a total row that we eventually don't want to keep. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to choose, so from our Add Column tab, I'm going to choose a conditional column. And this is going to be quite simple. We're just going to call this row type. And I'm going to say if the column month begins with the value total, then I want to consider that to be a total row type. And then otherwise, now in these conditional columns, I can create multiple clauses here, but because I've only got two values, whether it's a total or detail, all I have to do is create this first if statement, and then down in the else, if it's not a total column, we want to just consider it to be a detail column. So it's really that simple to create that row type. And then if I hit OK and take a look at our data, now the month data has detail by it, but you'll notice that the row type for the total is showing total. So that's the first step of identifying, do we want to keep this or do we want to exclude it in our final data? And then the next thing we want to do is somehow get this northeast over into a new column of its own, so that our January through December data here will be for northeast, and the region will be updated for each of our months data. So the way I'm going to do that is, again, I'm going to add a conditional column. I'm going to choose conditional column. Here I'm going to call this the region. And what I'm going to do here is, if our row type is equal to total, then we want to show the value from the month column. Okay, so if the row type is equal to total, we want to show the value from the month, and then otherwise we just want it to be null. So let's take a look at what this is actually doing. So once I type in null here, I'm going to hit OK, and now you'll see that in our region column we have the total row. This is the data that we want, and for the detail we have null. Now we'll populate that shortly after we perform a couple of steps to clean this up. So one of the first things I want to do is, I don't want total to be in our region column. I just want it to say northeast. So the way that we can do that is, if I have this region column selected, I can choose transform, and then there's an option here for replace values. So let me show you what we can do with that. So the value defined, we want to look for total. Now I'm going to include that the next space, because I want to take total as well as that following space out, and I'm going to replace it. I'm not going to replace it with anything, so I'm just going to leave that blank. And then if I hit OK, you'll now see that that total's been removed, and now I only have the region that we want. Okay, so the next problem that we've got to solve is how do we get northeast up beside of our month rows where we need it? And thankfully, Power Query has a really simple little function to do this. I'm going to keep that region column selected, and up here in the Any Column section of our Transform tab, we have Fill. And under Fill, we can choose Fill Up. And you'll notice once I selected that value that was on the total column, we've now filled it up to the top, and then it moves into our northwest, southeast, and then southwest data. So now we've got it almost where we want it. The last thing we need to do is just remove this row type. Now we added this row type so that we could do two different things. Number one is we want to filter the total columns out now. So that's the first thing we're going to do with this column. And then finally, we're just going to remove the column completely because we will no longer need it. So the first thing I'm going to do under row type is I'm going to drop this filter down, this options down that includes both our sort and our filter. But I'm just going to deselect total. I'm going to hit OK. Now we're left with just our month data and no total row. Now that's what we wanted. Now that we've got that data cleaned up, now we can just remove this column completely. I'm going to right click on it. By right clicking on it, I can choose remove. Now you can also do this on the toolbar, but it's a little bit easier for me to just right click the column and choose remove. And now we're down to the data in the format that we want it. Now let's look over to the right and look at our applied steps. When we apply a step, Power Query will add a description to each of those steps. Now, if you look over, the first four are pretty self-explanatory, but the next one where I added the conditional column for the row type, it just added a conditional column text there. Now I want to clean that up because I might look at this 3 months from now and not know what's going on. So instead of saying added conditional column, I'm going to change that to row type column. Moving down is where we added the region column. Let's change that to added. Clean this up a little bit. Region column. Here is where we removed the total prefix on our region. So I'm going to rename that to remove total prefix. I'm going to change this to fill up region. I'm going to change this one to, this is where we removed our total row. I'm going to change that to just removed total rows. And then I'm going to change this to removed row type column. Okay, so now we've got something that if we come back and look at this 3 months from now, we can scroll down through these descriptions and see what step was applied. Another great thing about Power Query is I can select that step and I can see what the data look like at that point. Now at this point we haven't even imported the data yet, but as we step down we can see the different forms of that data when that step was applied. So this is really a nice feature of Power Query, is I can time travel back and see what was going on at that previous step. Okay, now that we've got this done, if I go to my Home tab, I'm going to choose Close and Load here on the toolbar. And once I do that, it's going to recognize that, hey, I've got some new data. Let me create a new sheet. So it's created a sheet based on that Power Query name. You see sales data by month. And now we've got that saved in there. Okay? Now, here's the nice thing about Power Query 2 that I've already mentioned is let's look at the January 2022 Northeast amount. It's showing 120,686. Let me go back to our initial file and let's see how that gets imported in the next time you want to run Power Query. So for this January data, I'm going to change this to be 100,000. That's easy for us to find, and I'm going to save that and then close it. Now, because we already have those steps in place on the Power Query, now I can just simply right click here, refresh, and you'll notice now our data is updated. So what happened when I refreshed is Power Query went through all those steps that we had before and imported the new data. Now our new data had 100,000 for January, and it's applied all those steps, and it's updated that data that's now in our worksheet. So that's the real power of Power Query. Now next month, when I'm ready to do this, all I have to do is update the file, choose refresh here, and now I've got all my new data with those steps applied. Hope you found this helpful.